Hello, my name is PortlandHodl. Pretty famous, or not pretty famous, known on Twitter as like Bitcoin Edge. No, not very famous. Known for Bitcoin education, primarily through like slide decks on Twitter. And then secondly, the more controversial product I created at Marathon, Slipstream. And essentially, this is the impact of filtering on metaprotocols and kind of like more broadly mining in the Bitcoin ecosystem. But yeah, my ultimate kind of hypothesis to just sum this up real quick is that I believe that consensus should equal relay policy to avoid arbitraging opportunities in between those zones and create good relay on the gossip network. So let's dive into it. 1 second. There we go. Okay, so we're gonna go over kind of like some history of some meta protocols. Setup is like kind of going into like what is kind of some of this filtering terminology, like why it exists, why do people want to do it, and then different policy sets because, or sorry, not policy sets, but essentially the different types of policy, quote unquote, that are in Bitcoin, which is consensus, and then what you can get around the network, your meta protocol that you want to build, and how you will probably end up shaping yours around these policies and existing meta protocols that have essentially maybe not built in optimal ways because of existing policies. There are sometimes better ways to do it. And then essentially like the purpose of essentially some of these things, like why would we even put these filters in? And then I can break these cuffs, basically, like how do you kind of subvert some of this stuff? And then some of the negatives if Bitcoin does go the direction of today our consensus rules applying just policy, like is standard equals true today, you will end up with some probably not great things in Bitcoin. So the definition of filtering, I guess informally, is the act of rejecting valid Bitcoin transactions acceptance into a node's mempool and or not relaying that same transaction data to other nodes. So what you see on your Bitcoin node in terms of like its mempool contents is like the transaction accepted. The one rule, they must all be valid at least. And then you can also filter them by any number of other rules. Fee rates, number of descendants. You can even filter by TXID if you want to program that in there. That's your right to do that. It's your Bitcoin node. But more broadly, I'm going to be talking about filtering in terms of three groups today. There are filterers, which filter beyond kind of the default Bitcoin core policy. And what the Bitcoin core policy is like, it's roughly like this big, right? And it's a safe zone of transactions we know in Bitcoin that won't break anything a Raspberry Pi node can take in. It's overall healthy enough that the weakest link is not going to keel over. You can run a mining node on a Raspberry Pi. They do that. And then like the other side is like filterors, which shrink that set to not just include what is safe for Bitcoin, but ideologically saying that certain types of transactions typically involving meta protocols that they want to include. So not only is this transaction has to be safe for Bitcoin, it also maybe can't include a specific op0 op-if statement in there, or maybe an op return of a certain length. They will not accept that into their mempool in attempt to either not mine that transaction or stop that transaction from getting to a miner. And then also like filtering or not filtering is used by some pools as a marketing campaign exercise. Oh, I forgot to mention the third side is like when you take a policy that's standard core and you extend it out into every possible combination of things that you could basically consensus, you can also mine that way or relay transactions that way. It becomes very difficult though. The acts of filtering can be mostly non-impactful to incredibly impactful. We'll go over kind of the different types of filtering. A single economic node with no hash rate or no economic value is irrelevant in terms of filtering transactions. Mining nodes have quite a bit more power relative to their hash rate. And normally that is kind of in terms of if one miner will accept it, you can kind of delay the transaction, and no miners are typically orphaning blocks over specific types of currently consensus valid transactions. And then in my final kind of side of this, I'll have a visualization of like, what's the reality of like, in terms of relay nodes stopping you from sending your non-standard transaction to get to a miner, what percentage of nodes need to be involved with this filtering process to stop a behavior on Bitcoin? So here's like some kind of like, this is not exactly a meta protocol per se, but it existed as a layer on top of Bitcoin. It's provably fair, but not trustless because you're still depending on a payout. But Satoshi's dice was around in 2012 to about 2014 and accounted for almost 50% of Bitcoin traffic by creating a bunch of UTXOs that would then immediately pay you back out a payout based on the address you sent to. I send 0.1 sats to a certain address. There can be up to 1 sat to a certain address. You could get up to a 65.535x payout on that. Luke Dash Jr. This was the first kind of introduction to filtering. He literally patched the repository version of Bitcoin Core for Gen 2 to add in a blacklist to essentially get rid of these Satoshi dice addresses and not allow transactions to enter the mempool of Gen 2 based nodes. And his pool, Allegis had is notorious as a secondary function that would not accept TXs to a specific address starting in 1 dice. And that's where the first kind of like filtering began. And then the first like meta protocol on Bitcoin that had some influence on just kind of policy in general was Counterparty. So Counterparty was a meta protocol essentially for issuing assets on top of Bitcoin that started with, you'd have to like create a transaction on Bitcoin to put the data there. And it was done through originally opcheck multisig in these fake pub keys. And what that means is they were kind of just doing it in the worst way possible because it was creating a lot of UTXOs that would be unspendable forever. Also a little bit more expensive because of the dust. Then this kind of came around into the op return debate, the initial sets of them, which was to introduce op return in 2014. That became like how much data these guys need really to essentially get the job done. The answer ended up being around 80 bytes at the end. And then essentially, like Luke also patched for Counterparty as well with do not permit bear or permit bear multisig equals 0. So just don't relay these types of transactions. And then he also went on to state that, like, hey, other miners should be participating in this act of filtering out these types of transactions, which was an instance of, hey, I want to curtail behavior on Bitcoin through the use of mempool-based policy filtering. And then this also seems like the inspiration for Bitcoin stamps or the toxic waste meta protocol, where you can embed your JPEGs into Bitcoin forever in the UTXO set. So meta protocols exist and interact with policy essentially as the meta protocols are the data. Meta protocols need data written to Bitcoin, and policy defines kind of like what friction level you're going to experience trying to get that data on Bitcoin. So for example, putting 4 megabytes in a single transaction used to be pretty high friction. If your meta protocol needed that much, you might have to engineer around that. If you're within the bounds of standardness, it's probably very easy to deal with. So this is kind of my example of these policies. And what this is like what transactions can make it, or sorry, this is like the scope of transactions that can exist in Bitcoin are in this purple circle. So that's like the laws of physics. What can happen on Earth, or essentially what can happen in Bitcoin. But what can happen and what does happen is very different. So this is essentially like Bitcoin Core right here. I mentioned like the size or scope of the rules. You have this, which is standard. And that is essentially like the Bitcoin Core's rules for what transactions are good. This is your common address set. But there's a note. Miners want to make money, right? And so miners will sometimes take in safe-ish for their hardware transactions. And this is a set of currently easily mineable TXs. And then essentially there's also this right here. This is the set of transactions that are valid, like physics. You can do bad things. You also can do bad things in Bitcoin that are consensus valid, that you can get mined if you know the right people. But you typically don't want people to be doing this all the time. And so that's kind of what standardness does. It ensures that, hey, like let's not let this set of very bad things intersect with the things that are currently easily mineable or just like is part of this standardness set, because you don't want people deliberately DOSing the Bitcoin network with opcheck sig 100 times in an out point, multiply that across 22,000 out points, you got a 25-minute block. It's quite problematic. You can also attack the miners as well through some of these types of transactions or chains of transactions. So if you kind of link a bunch children transactions together, in that transaction, that chain is long enough or big enough, breaking that chain is very expensive for the miner and can affect their ability to take transactions into the mempool. So when you're building or like a policy set, You want to make sure the miner doesn't get DOSed by that kind of behavior, since the descend to limit of 25. So that was my thesis. Some like a little bit ironic is Luke usually ends up at the bottom of all policy debates online. You'll find him Bitcoin Talk, Reddit, etc. But one of the statements he made on Bitcoin Talk to Sergio when first discussing the first Bitcoin DOS vector was blocking out non-standard transactions in general just harms potential innovation. Luke now runs a pool that has the most restrictive policy set in Bitcoin per miners. 2013, yeah. So there's about a 20 post thread about how you can actually attack Bitcoin with a DOS block. And it outlines how to do it. And yeah, this was his response to that. I find it a little bit ironic. Nonetheless, people change their minds. This is where we're at today versus where we were. And kind of like my second thing is that like the love of policy is the root of all evil in Bitcoin, because Bitcoin devs have spent a lot of time dealing with like policy debates. We recently had op return in the Bitcoin core repo that had like brigade-like behavior. This is yet another example of like, hey, like we want to change like kind of the parameters or tuning slides of what's allowed in Bitcoin, and you just end up with like these threads every once in a while that draw a lot of attention. They become lightning rods, etc. So I would prefer this behavior doesn't exist, hence just make policy consensus, move forward. So the heart of the filter is standard. So that's what I kind of mentioned in the beginning, is standard equals true. Set that to yes, you'll allow all transactions. But we don't do that. We actually have inside of isStandard, there's a function called solver. And so isStandard calls the solver thing. And what the solver does is it looks at your out point, and it'll go, OK, what type of script are you? Are you good or are you bad? And by that, what it essentially is doing is it's usually looking for the primary things: address types, op return, anchors, and pay to public key or pay to multisig. Those are the permissed out points. There is 2 input checks as well for specific SegWit rules. And then, yeah, miners can increase or decrease this kind of setting to really just change the profitability of their pool depending on demand for specific activities. An example is demand for large ordinals it does exist. It is quite profitable to mine those transactions. That is not a part of the set that is allowed by default. The miner can add into their solver, allow for the weight units to be greater than this and assign a type to it, and you can then mine it. So the policy controls what goes into the mempool, and the mempool is important for mining nodes because mining nodes produce the next block. And as you can see in this visualization here from Ocean, they will preview what's in their mempool. Same thing as mempool.space will do, but theirs is like what is filtered. And that is essentially the things you can get written to the chain is defined largely by about 12 to 13 mining pools that each run a Bitcoin node that creates one of these templates. And the policy is the rule of what goes into their template. So I show Ocean here. They're filtering out all their spam. And then down here is a little internal view of a marathon mempool.space instance. And you can see like there's a giant 4 mega in there just waiting to get mined. So, and then, yeah, policy rules are mostly evaluated at the mempool level, and consensus rules are the rules of all possible things in Bitcoin. Those are only evaluated technically to the full scope at the block acceptance level. So what that means is, though a transaction isn't allowed by policy, so the miner may filter out that transaction from their mempool, that does not mean that that is violating any rules in Bitcoin. And when the block comes in, you only apply the consensus rules, the rules of physics to Bitcoin. And examples are this would be a double op return or a large op return. Most miners used to not allow this. Some do. That doesn't mean you can't do it in Bitcoin. It just means they don't want it in their mempool. But if it does end up in a block, and that block gets propagated onto the network, the Bitcoin nodes around the network will not apply their own mempool policies, but instead just check that it's consensus valid. I can take this in. It is valid Bitcoin. It's basically like local laws versus the rules of physics. So if you're building a meta protocol, you're very likely interested in like, okay, how do I not create a bunch of friction for my users to essentially interact with this? You don't want to have a meta protocol, for example, that currently uses double op returns for any reason, because your user, if they have a wallet and they need to make an on-chain Bitcoin transaction, it won't probably get mined very easily because of the fact that the nodes that mine don't typically accept that other than Mara, basically. Maybe in the future now. But yeah, there's also many other issues like you got to take into account like minimum fee rates. There's also some other things that policy has done in a negative way in terms of shaping meta protocols. An example of this would be that, for example, Citria, they decided to use 2 taproot outputs to store some data because they needed 64 extra bytes. You can actually do that with other methods. Like maybe you could have just allowed for a bigger op return instead of them putting more out points on the chain, or maybe a pay to public key, but then because nobody used pay to public key and we just demonstrated a PR where somebody's trying to remove it, maybe it's a little too risky for them to want to potentially add friction later on to their protocol because somebody decides they want to filter it out at the level of policy on the mining nodes that pretty much all run Bitcoin Core. So some good ways this has actually shaped meta protocols was Casey Rodemore. He uses Leb 128 to encode runes. That is a very efficient protocol, and he also uses op return, and that allowed kind of him to create op returns that could encode entire ticker symbols, quantities, etc., in op returns that are so lightweight that they would even pass through filters like by Ocean that are even half the size of what our normal core nodes will run. So essentially what all this comes down to is if you build a meta protocol, you don't want to violate policy typically because it increases friction. But secondly, you don't want to get extorted by the miners. And so if, for example, your whole meta protocol depends on this one specific trick that maybe an annex that Marathon will accept. And that meta protocol becomes very popular, right? And Mara goes, hey, I'm not saying they would ever do this, conflict of interest. Your fees are a little bit too low for us. And we kind of know that nobody else is going to take this. And you're in a really bad spot right now because maybe you need to get out of a bridge or something. What can you really do? You know, that is a bad situation to get in. So by kind of following that first in that diagram of circles, like that is standard policy, you're kind of guaranteeing things are pretty reasonably safe. So some modern examples of meta protocols and how they interface with specifically filters or policy. Ordinals, this is not filterable because this is literally just SAT counting. Like every transaction includes ordinals. You use ord, you can view it. There's no way to get around that. The inscriptions portion is a little bit different because of the fact that you're now having a specific type of transaction that has a signature to basically attach this data that you're storing on Bitcoin into that ordinal so it can get transferred around using that social consensus of the ord client. Okay, so this now implements 2 things. People will attempt to filter it through like the ord filter in Bitcoin knots, but it also can add value to your inscription potentially by basically doing something that's very difficult, like a 4-megger. People have literally ascribed like the fact you're doing it will increase the value. People don't like this. Maybe it's more notoriety. I don't know. That's what happens. Second, there's like BRC20, which rides on top of inscriptions, which rides on top of ordinals. These also can be filtered out because they're basically like same thing as inscriptions, but the total amount of data these typically use is very low. Runes, filterable because they have a signature in the beginning, op return, op 13, I believe. So that, alkanes, same deal. And then RGB, they all basically have signatures. So in essence, most of these protocols were built around ensuring that they would comply with standardness policy, but also a lot of them do support the ability to go outside. Inscriptions, you can build non-standard transactions that still work. Runes, you can create a giant edict, for example, that is the whole block of transferring these runes around. That will be consensus valid. It's just very difficult to do. So there are some protocols that literally rode in the coattails of some of the, basically some of the attention that recently happened to op return, op 20s. That was a literal meta protocol about just having op returns that were bigger than standardist policy allowed. And this showed that even in the face of filters and basically no mining pool other than MAR and F2 mining these transactions, people still absolutely got them all mined. Like this, maybe there's no demand for the protocol now, but during that moment, nobody was stopped from doing what they wanted to on Bitcoin. So this goes in the next section. Like, okay, there's 2 types of filtering. So policy-based filtering by miners is highly effective. Like if your proportion of the hash rate determines the delay that transaction will very likely take, if a policy is implemented across all miners, for example, right now, Bitcoin, probably by the centralized group, I'm not going to say all miners, there may be some BitAxe that is running this, you can't get a non-standard script pub key in. Even Mara won't allow that. It's too risky in terms of like what that company would like to do. If there's nobody supporting that by policy, it literally will never get written to the chain. It will enter no mempools, enter no block templates, not get mined. The second is node relay-based filtering. This is where I may install Core or my own Libra or Knots and say like, hey, I'm going to filter out transactions. It's largely for the vibes. You can feel good, but it's not, and I'll show later, it's not highly impactful at actually stopping behavior in the face of demand. So my first thought experiment is going to be, I'm a Bitcoin miner. This is the last transaction that is going into my block. It technically fits. It is actually potentially the lowest paying. But you're a Bitcoin miner, select one. Which are you going to take? They're both the same exact size. They have all the same out points except for the value. TX1 pays 1 Bitcoin. TX2 pays 10 Bitcoin in fees. Which one do you select? You don't know what's in that. Yeah, TX2. Most people would say that rationally. But yeah, like miners want to make more money, and very few people answer this question with what is inside the transaction. It's greedy miner want more. So yeah, that's where Mara Slipstream comes in, and metaprotocols have heavily used this in terms of just getting transactions that are hard to get mined. And so basically this allows for very large transactions, more op returns, which large transactions typically are inscriptions. Op returns have been used by runes. Opcheck multisig, stamps have used them. Ancestor descendant chains, runes. People will create like these giant, yeah. There was a lot of developer feedback that, script pub key? Sorry, I thought you were talking about op6sx. I apologize. Script pub key was deprecated because of the fact that after my research into the DOS block at opnext and the amount of volume of people demanding like non-standard script pub keys, the trade-offs are not worth it currently. If demand shows up for non-standard script pub keys, absolutely will revisit that and make a specific filter for those opchecksig transactions that we don't like, but right now it's just like terms of time, it's easier just to take it out. So what happens if you run a loose mempool and start accepting transactions? You start making more fees. So average block fees, here's an example of Mara, and I think I should have a nice little example here of current mining pools based on mempool.space. This is the profitability in fees. Currently, on the 24-hour, Mara's earned 8.4% more fees through Slipstream. And you notice they're pretty much all red because they don't ever quite make the exact template mempool.space thinks they can make. But that profitability extends deep into Mara's history, specifically because of how many transactions over time we've accepted. So over 3 months, or 1 month, 11% extra fees. Even if you go back 1 year, you're still at 6% extra fees. And then you go down to like even before Slipstream was created, you're actually bringing that average out of the negative on the long-term basis. And then pools like specifically Ocean will, I believe you'll probably see like more negative, let's see. Yeah, negative 12% for a pool like Ocean that typically selects out transactions. So that is because they're not basically profit maximizing, instead selecting for policy. Okay. So yeah, I'll sum this one up pretty quickly, but the stats for Mara Slipstream, 17.4 extra Bitcoin since the launch, 11.9 were considered profit based on what we could have made versus what we did make and subtracting one from the other. So relay policy is really there for one reason, and this affects metaprotocols because obviously people want to do all sorts of transactions, but it's to okay, I'm gonna speed this portion up. But like as a transaction propagates around the network, every node along the chain must validate that it's good to go in its mempool. You want that transaction, that set of things that is standard, to be very lightweight because nodes like Raspberry Pis need to be able to decentralize the Bitcoin network. But the guys building blocks are miners. miners don't have to have a Raspberry Pi to validate that, hey, the transaction's good. They run Xeon servers or AWS instances that have 128 cores or whatnot, or just very high CPU frequency. And essentially why that actually has an impact is because when a miner takes in non-standard transactions that are hard to validate, get across the network, they only technically have to have nodes, these Raspberry Pis, validate them once every 10 minutes on average, because once the block comes out with that non-standard transaction or that big one, essentially the nodes will validate it. But it's not the same as essentially like a relay or that gets gossip for standard or a regular transaction, sorry, where every single time somebody could RBF a 4 megabyte inscription again and again and again, causing the node to basically stall out or have to work very hard or potentially DOS it into not operating. So yeah, okay, I went over the validation period. The note about if you do decide to like go outside of policy and modify your Bitcoin core to do this, you're technically becoming slightly at risk to invalid blocks. So one example, Mara decided to, this was not me by the way, decided to modify their Bitcoin node and to select by transaction order, ordered from lowest fee to highest fee without regard for child transactions, and yeah, got wrecked on a block. So if you do sell yourself as I'm going to be the node guy to a pool, I'm going to earn you more money by essentially using non-standard transactions, then yeah, you technically could blow up a block and you'll have a really bad day. No. No, essentially, it's just getting cut off. But yeah, essentially like, okay, yeah, the blue dots essentially are children that got placed before the parents in the order of that block. And yeah, invalid. So how effective is filtering? This was my big experiment, was I wanted to quantify how many nodes would have to be participating in filtering a specific type of transaction to stop it from getting mined, with the assumption that miners will accept the type of transaction that is attempting to get mined. So yeah, filtering by miners is highly effective, as literally if you have 1% of the hash rate filtering, then you can delay that transaction by 1% of the time of blocks made. Nobody's orphaning currently, but yeah, essentially you have to get your transaction that you want for your meta protocol or whatever into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 primary mempools, and you're going to get into that kind of like 97.28% of hash rate, unless you want to wait for that other 2%, and maybe it still gets in, but most people use Bitcoin Core. So miners have the control of what's getting written to the chain. The policy that miners run in general will determine the time it takes to get in a block. It is highly effective. Example, script pub keys. They don't happen on Bitcoin because none of these mining groups support that. Another example of what's kind of been happening recently with policy is, this is not even a change Bitcoin Core made. Miners just decided to start doing this to earn extra revenue. This all kind of started with me at Mara. Essentially, the mempool is empty, and I went to one of my reports, or a person I report to. It's like, hey, can we just start taking sub 1 sat per vbyte? Said yes, okay, and then you guys can all yell about block propagation, how bad it is, but just earn extra revenue. F2 pool starts accepting them. Luxor starts joining in, Spider, Ant pool, and literally, if there's some case to be profitable, it probably can happen in the face of demand. And demand happened for this literally by people figuring out that Mara would mine these. And there is an economic incentive to save potentially thousands on your transactions by hitting 0.1 sats per vbyte and getting into a block. So how it started, a few days ago, Mara finally mined this 0.1 sat per vbyte transaction that I started broadcasting via the public peer-to-peer relay a month ago. How it's going. Yeah, like your 50+% of hash rate now is accepting transactions at sub 1 sat per vbyte. So this is the other side of filtering. So let's say you have a node, but you don't have any hash rate. And what this experiment proved to me, it's largely ineffective. And to quantify it, it requires about 90% of nodes to filter a transaction before I deem it to become problematic. You're starting to hit kind of that 1 out of 10 tries of just random peering. You're going to fail. 95% plus of nodes that filter will make it basically kind of impossible to get to a miner. Neither are completely impossible. Even if you have 100% of relay nodes filtering, the miners are not filtering in this case, and they will. You can technically have a chance to peer with them as a part of the set, and essentially like, yeah, Sybil attacks you could try, but you would have to spend quite a bit to make that happen by creating a bunch of nodes on like AWS and then filtering, and then you'd probably need a bigger ASN range because Bitcoin only allows 2 connections per ASN. Yeah, relay filtering basically can give you a false sense of like you're having an influence or control on a permissionless network of like the transactions getting mined. You can control what goes into your mempool, but very likely you're not stopping anything from happening. So, I accidentally forgot the meme. But yeah, what's the difference between my top image of 0% filtering and then that's like 90% filtering? They're literally the same picture. There's no difference. It's still getting through. So yeah, essentially I'll show kind of my results of my simulation here. I'll wrap this up, apologize. So what I did with this represents, let's see. Anytime I go in there, it's going to show the little slider. But yeah, you have your broadcast node that wants to mine a specific transaction that will be deemed filterable by any filter nodes in this graph of 5,000 I chose specifically because the CPU capacity. Get into 20K nodes, it was a little bit hard to deal with. But the results, even when I did that for those slow runs, was still roughly the same. So essentially, at 0% of nodes filtering, you're basically going to always get a hit into a miner. And they're in the center of the group, and the red dots represent filters. So you keep going through, and you can see, like, okay, the filter percent's now at 10%. You're still, like, every single graph, you have a connection made. So you're starting to get, like, more and more filters. 70%, there's no misses. But then I think you start getting some misses, like, right around, and I'll show the quantitative graphs. Yep, right here. So at 93%, you start seeing like, okay, but I just scroll a few more instances, you're still getting some connections. But as you go through, now we're all the way at 96%. You're still occasionally getting it, but your normal peers, you're starting to have trouble getting relayed. And by the time you're all the way at 98. So if you are advocating for Bitcoin knots and the filter policy, you're going to need a recruitment operation. And I appreciate your efforts, and please do. Bitcoin is permissionless. You're allowed to do it. But this is literally pretty much the math behind it. And each one of these instances was a random set of peers and connections, so kind of like Monte Carlo style. So, no. I'll show you the graph technically like earlier, but yeah, I definitely had like at 70% you get your first miss on. And remember, this is a random simulation. You do one more, you're going to hit it. Yeah, you're going to try again, it's going to work. Oh man, okay, I'll wrap this up. Okay, so here's the reality of like, okay, I'm coming from the viewpoint of like, I want to filter on Bitcoin. I want my operation to be successful. This type of transaction doesn't exist. You can get somebody to have their first bit of trouble at roughly 70%. At 80%, you start kind of seeing that climb into, and by the way, the top graph represents the filter rate of that transaction. And at 100%, yes, you finally basically stop the transaction. But until you get 80%, you don't see any meaningful results. And this could be variance in the number of runs I did. It was about 15 per. And then, yeah, that's the math. So basically 90%, you're starting to see something. This, I ran it over the course of like 3 days. Like this week. Yeah, it's open source. I have a repository for this. If you want to, I think that yeah, you can check the repo, but I have all the source code, so you can actually run this and generate your own graphs. And you can tune the sliders to be more or less. So okay, so this last section is how do you beat the odds of okay, I do want to get my transaction into a mempool like Mara or potentially F2 or one of these other ones. The first way, this is pretty cheap but lacks a verify, so you can't guarantee that your transaction made it. Literally just modify your net.h file on your Bitcoin node and set your default max peer connections from 125, because that's what, if you have a Bitcoin node, even if you set the number of peer connections in the config file greater than 125, it actually will not break that limit. you can literally just set it to some big number, and then you'll be able to connect to thousands of nodes. There's my node I had connecting to 1,001 total connections. I'm going to note you are being bad when doing this. Like you're taking up those valuable slots. Bitcoin is probably not intended to run like this with a bunch of like giant nodes just trying to bypass policy. But again, permissionless network, you're allowed to do it. TX Pigeon. This is how you could like poop on network policy. Basically, StuTXO, who's in the audience here, created a very cool tool to essentially, you don't even run a Bitcoin node. It actually just uses the Bitcoin protocol. So the network communication, it basically mocks a Bitcoin node. And it will blast off this transaction to try to find Libra relays, or the loosest policy on the network. And then it uses the get data to determine if the TX has landed on its target. So you get a little bit of feedback if you have basically successfully gotten into a Libra relay mempool, which will very likely kind of hit one of the miners like Mara or F2. Yeah, so definitely like check out TX Pigeon if your transaction is hard to get across the network for any reason or get to a miner. I'm going to skip that for time. And then the last is like not attacking Bitcoin, script pub key stuff. Like miners don't want to be bad. This is likely still part of any miner's policy. Just, yeah. And then in conclusion, metaprotocols are still largely defined by the broad network policy in Bitcoin. So though inscriptions could have used the annex, it probably very likely was too difficult to deal with, or nobody wanted to do it. And then, yeah, they can be extended typically by non-standard transactions. So like example, the giant edict. Currently, if there's a delta between the value of standard transactions and non-standard transactions, miners will profit from this. That's the policy arbitrage that happens. And then final note, Core has been loosening policy recently. So over the past like 3 patches, like full RBF, you got now op return, ephemeral anchors, truck. The mempool is actually becoming more and more friendly to all sorts of types of Bitcoin transactions, whether or not you want to do a cool script for yourself, or you have an inscription, or you just want to have fun with Bitcoin script. That's it. Questions? We got one?
Good afternoon. Thank you for your talk. Would you address, because you mentioned that it's like miner filtering is very effective. So could you address what the compounding effects would be of not simply miners participating in filtering, but then if there was congestion? So it's like, okay, if your transaction was delayed by 1%, but what if there was a lot of non-standard transactions trying to get into blocks, like more than could fit in the next block?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting one. But oh, sorry. Wait, this goes. Yes. Okay. That is quite interesting because of the fact that there's only 2 ways it can happen, or 3. 1, participants in these delayed transactions will have to wait, because remember basically the node with the loosened policy, I'm assuming, to get this transaction in will only have so much bandwidth per day in terms of block space they can create. Second, it can also create a fee market for these non-standard transactions where essentially, because of that limited bandwidth, they may start RBFing to essentially, hey, like, okay, I know that I need this bad. Essentially, you'll find the market value of like what the time preference is for that amount of hash rate that allows that to happen. And then the third knock on, especially if the second happens, would be other pools start joining in. Because once the profitability is there, we've seen like other pools want to do this. An example, Slipstream started taking 4 megas for up to 4 megabytes for basically any witness that's Taproot. And Antpool, F2, many pools now have agreements to allow these things to happen because there's some ability to profit from it. And so once that per vbyte, miners also jumped on that. Even for several $100s a block, they will literally start partaking in these behaviors.
So in a circumstance where you had some percentage of miners filtering and there was a lot of demand for block space, you would effectively have a limit in how much non-standard transactions were getting onto the blockchain, right?
Absolutely. Variant because of luck, right? Maybe that miner gets really lucky, but yeah, like if I have 1% of the network hash rate, there's 144 blocks a day, you basically can produce up to 6 megabytes of witness data a day that you can pump through your little 1% pool on average. If other miners join in, great. Then you have more hash rate to allow that to happen.
So yeah, so then if more miners started participating, that would, create less of a fee market there because there's more
Absolutely, yeah.
available.
That's actually like the thesis with Slipstream was the product would obsolete itself when I created it. I was literally like, other miners will start copying this, and then the fee arbitrage would go away. Example, op return is a relatively small portion of the amount of revenue Slipstream receives, but with the new Bitcoin Core patch or PR that they merged, that revenue stream is now gone. Like nobody will need that service. They won't have to go to the Slipstream portal to dump their transactions in to make this happen. Okay. Thank you.